Hello everybody, if it's your first time with us today, welcome, and if you're back once again, welcome back. Today we're continuing our series on beginner strategy, and we're going to look at trading pieces. When should we trade pieces, and when should we not be trading off our pieces during our chess matches? So the first position that we're going to be looking at today, we're going to talk about tactical reasons to trade pieces. So the primary reason that we would want to swap our pieces off is going to be that, well, we're kind of forced to. Either it's going to prevent us from losing material, or potentially we have a way to gain material. So it's always good to trade pieces if we can win something from it, and if it's going to give us something good. But of course, sometimes we might have to avoid a loss of material ourselves. So what's going on in this position here? Well, let's imagine it's black's move first of all. If it's black's move, how can he trade pieces to win a piece? We notice that white's bishop is a little bit precariously placed on the c5 square here, and the only thing defending it is the knight. So if it's black's move, his idea here is going to be to play the move bishop takes e4, and after white recaptures either king takes e4 or f takes e4, then we're going to be able to play rook takes c5, and black's going to win a bishop. That would be really good for the black pieces and a great reason to trade pieces, right? Trade them off, that way you can win some more. Well, let's say that it's white's move. So if we're white, how can we prevent that from happening? We don't want to lose this bishop, so what can we do as white here in order to stop black from taking our pieces? Well, there's not a lot of ways we can defend this bishop. Our pawn blocks our rook in here. He can't really come up to defend. It's not going to work very well. We can't bring the king over to defend. That's not going to work. Of course, we can't move the knight because it's the only piece defending it. And all of the squares the bishop can go to are covered up. So what should we do? How can we avoid a loss of material? In this case, there's only one option, and that's going to be to play bishop takes b6. So we're going to capture that knight. Remember, knights and bishops have roughly the same value. So if we go ahead and take that knight, we're making an equal trade-off, and even though we couldn't keep the bishop on the board, we didn't lose an extra piece, right? And black's not winning anything. So trade pieces, either to gain more pieces because it's going to give you a tactical advantage, or if you have to prevent losing material. That's our first and simplest reason. Next, we're going to look at an opening position here. This is a game that was played between two beginner to intermediate level players, and we're going to see what happens here in this opening when we should and shouldn't be trading off some pieces. Now, it's white to move here. You'll notice the pawn structures are very symmetrical, right? And both pawns on both sides of the board, they just end up mirroring each other. Things look pretty even. It's early on, and both sides want to find ways to bring their pieces into the game and develop. White plays queen a4, which is not typically the best idea in the opening to bring your queen out early here, but it does bring a piece into the game. He's trying to get a quick attack, and we'll see how this ends up working out here. Black plays knight to d7 to defend, and now white plays a move that's a little precarious. Perhaps he missed black's defensive idea and thought that he could get a quick attack here with knight to e5, right? White has a pin on the knight, so he's trying to attack the pinned piece. That's a typical motif, a typical idea we want to do. Well, black has the very simple move here, knight to f6. Now you see this knight on d7 is defended 3 times, so even if white were to bring this bishop in b5, there's still adequate defense here. It's not enough for white to be able to really gain material. And the next couple moves, we're going to look at what happens. So white right now, even though he looks like he's pressuring, he's attacking, he has less pieces out in the center of the board. I mean, black has now developed 1, 2, 3 pieces. White has a knight on e5, and he has this queen over here on a4, so maybe you could call it 2, but he's falling behind in development, so he needs to start bringing his pieces into the game. But what happens here instead? White plays knight takes d7. this is kind of starting to show when we don't want to trade our pieces. So if we need to start developing, if we're behind in development, or even if we're ahead in development in the opening, we want to make sure we're getting our pieces where they need to go to be able to attack. If we start moving multiple times just to trade off pieces, it actually allows our opponent to catch up to or pass us in that development, and that's what's about to happen in this game. Black played knight takes d7. He didn't want to offer a queen trade just yet. And then white plays bishop b4, or bishop b5 rather, keeping that pin on the knight, and this will make it difficult for black to castle potentially, because if the king leaves that defense of the knight, then white can take it. But black, well, he's not really under attack just yet. White doesn't have another way to pile on. He already got rid of his other knight, so he just makes a nice developing move, bishop d6. White castles, king safety, and now black plays a6. And here, once again, white decides to trade pieces. Bishop takes d7. And what we're about to see here is that white is giving up any advantage that he had from the first move, any chance that he had from developing early on, having that advantage. It's slipping away. Black has his two bishops in the game already, and now, after queen takes d7, white doesn't have any pieces developed. His pieces are still back here on b1 and c1. White even goes on and decides to trade the queens off. Queen takes queen and king takes queen, and if we look at this position, yes, the king's in the center of the board, but with the queens off, this is actually a good thing for black. This is something he's going to be able to make use of in the endgame. That's something we'll study more when we do some of our endgame study, but black has two nice centralized pieces. White still has to get his pieces out into the game, and really, white gained nothing from this sort of play. He traded off his pieces early, but this is actually a better game currently for black. So in the opening, what we want to make sure is that we're not just trading pieces for the sake of it. A common mistake I see beginners make is that they think things are just going to be simpler if they can get a few pieces off of the board. They might look at this position and say, well, I got the queens off, so it can't be that bad for me. He can't really attack me right away. But white is actually worse here. His pieces aren't in the game yet. Black's already getting ready to bring his rooks onto the c-file. He can play moves like rook c8. He can double on the c-file after that with moves like maybe rook c4 and the other one over. Black has a very clear plan, a very clear way to increase his advantage and keep pressing, whereas white is behind in time. White needs to start coming up with some creative ideas. So one of those pitfalls, don't think that just by trading off pieces it's going to give you a nice comfortable game. Make sure that we're keeping that tension, develop our pieces in the opening. Don't be afraid of the position being complicated just because there's more pieces on the board. Rise to that challenge, be willing to calculate lines, or else you're going to find yourself in worse endgames, which can lose just as well as a worse opening. So let's look at our next board here. What's the next thing we want to talk about? Well, we've talked about tactical moments and we've talked about development. Now we're going to talk a little bit about space. So this is a position which arises from the Queen's Indian defense. It's a system that black uses against a queen-pawn opening of d4. And what you'll notice is that all of the black pieces here are on the 6th rank or back, right? All these pieces are cramped down in those first 3 rows. Everything's looks a little tight on the board. White has a little bit more space. He's got pawns on d4 and c4. He has a nice central spatial advantage. It's black to move here, so how is black going to try to relieve some of that pressure, right? If he makes a move like, let's say, knight to c6, which would be a normal developing move, well, white's going to be able to play moves like e4, he can bring his bishop out, he's going to have a natural way to keep building his spatial advantage, which eventually will be problematic for black. So black here is actually going to play the move knight to e4. Why do we want to do that? Look, we're offering up this trade of knights, right? Well, the reason has to do with space. So if you have a disadvantage in space, if your position is more cramped, you want to try to get some pieces off of the board. That's going to make the spatial advantage of your opponent less so. He has less to work with. The reason that space is good is that it gives us more room for our pieces to maneuver in. So if we have less pieces, it doesn't do as much good for us. And secondly, we want to get our pieces out. We need to make more space for ourselves. We need to strike back. So if we can trade off some of our pieces, it opens up more squares now. For example, this f6 square is not occupied anymore. Maybe I'll be able to bring my bishop there. Maybe I'll even play moves like d6, knight b d7, and then this knight over to f6. It starts to uncramp our position. Now, if we're the white pieces here, what do we want to do? Well, we have a spatial advantage, so we don't want to trade. We don't want to play the move knight takes e4. We want to do something different because, well, we have that advantage in space. So let's say that white plays a move like queen c2, putting that pressure on. What is the principle we just talked about as black? We're behind in space, so we want to trade pieces. So here, black's going to go ahead and take the knight. White recaptures, because of course he doesn't want to lose material. And now we see both sides have gained a little bit of something. White still has his nice c4 and d4 pawns. The queen is in the center. He's got 3 pieces developed. So he's still a little bit ahead in development. He's still got some nice central space. But black now has some other ideas. Maybe he'll play d6, knight d7, knight f6, or maybe we can just play the very simple move f5 and get more space on the king side. So when we have a spatial disadvantage, when we're cramped, trading pieces is good for us. When we have a spatial advantage, we want to maintain that tension. We want to keep from trading off pieces. That way we can give more space for our pieces to move around and try to press that advantage. What's the next thing to talk about? Well, our next position here, we're going to talk about what to do if we're up or down in material. So in this game, black just played the move pawn d takes c4 with check. So it's a discovered check here on the opponent's king. Now white has to determine how is he going to get out of check. Should white move his king to a square like f1, h2, h1, or h2? Or should he try to block the check with a move like queen e3, queen f2, or a rook move into the middle? Those are the decisions white has to make here. Well, how is the material count right now? If we look at the board, white has 4 pawns and a bishop, 2 rooks and the queen. Black has 5 pawns and the knight, 2 rooks and the queen. So black is up a pawn here, and it's this pawn on c3, so he's got kind of a dangerous looking passed pawn, right? So as the black pieces, since he's up in material, black wants to trade pieces off the board. If he could get the rooks off and the bishop and the knight and the queens, he could push this pawn and try to win the game, right? So he wants to trade off pieces. That way he can get to that winning endgame. As white, we don't want that to happen. We want to avoid trading pieces. The reason for that is the more pieces we have on the board, the better chance we have at being able to put up a defense. For example, this queen is attacking c3 and this rook is attacking c3 now. So that could be a difficult pawn for black to defend. If white simply plays a move like king to h2, then maybe white's going to be able to get this pawn back on the next move. Well, black can make some trades in order to try to defend it, but white's going to have some chance to defend, and he's going to have more resources available to him. Let's see what happened in the game, though. In the game, white played the move queen to e3. And let's go ahead and flip this position around here. That way we can think, what should we do with black? remember, we're up in material, so we want to trade those pieces down. We want to be able to press into a winning endgame. So what should we play? Queen takes queen check. And then after rook takes queen, how can we get even more pieces off the board? Well, one idea would be to play knight takes bishop, but there's a way to force even more pieces off the board here. How can we do that? How can we attack the bishop and make white defend it? Rook to e8. So now the bishop is pinned. The knight and the rook both attack it. White's going to have to defend it again. White probably won't lose the bishop here, but black can force more pieces off the board. So after rook a e1, now black can trade everything down. Rook takes bishop, rook takes rook, knight takes rook, rook takes knight. And now after the very simple move rook to c8, black is completely winning. He has this extra passed pawn. It's going to try to march down the board here. White has to play the rook back to e1 and then to c1 to blockade it, and then he's going to be completely tied down while black is able to activate his king and win the endgame. Now, we'll talk more about these sort of endgames in some other videos. That way you know whether to evaluate them, how to know, am I winning, am I losing, should I trade pieces off? If you know that your endgame is going to be winning, then you want to get pieces off the board because you have a simple path to victory. However, if you don't evaluate the endgame correctly, maybe you need to keep some more pieces on. That way you get some more chances. So when you're up in material, we want to trade pieces off. That's going to help us to get to those simplified winning endgames. But when we're down in material, we want to keep pieces on the board. We want to give ourselves more chances to defend. There's one more position we're going to look at here today. And the last thing, this comes from a Budapest defense. You'll notice that black has gambited a pawn here. White actually has an extra pawn here on e5. Black lost his e-pawn. And with black's last move, he played bishop b4 check, and then the knight came out to c3. This is the Budapest gambit, an opening that black plays. And he gives up a pawn here, but he's able to create some weaknesses. So the last thing is, even though we're down in material as black here, another reason we might want to trade pieces would be to create weaknesses. So in this position, what's black going to do? Well, the move here is going to be bishop takes c3. And why does black do that? We just said that when you're down in material, we don't want to trade pieces off, right? Well, the reason is white has to capture back here, b takes c3, and now white has two isolated doubled pawns. So there's no b pawn anymore, there's no d pawn anymore, and these two pawns on the c file cannot be supported. They're out there, and they're going to make fixed targets for the rest of the game. They're going to be targets for black to be able to potentially attack and hopefully take advantage of, even though he's down a pawn. So, what did we learn from all this? Why should we trade pieces? Well, if we can create a weakness, trade our pieces for that. If we're up in material and we can get to a known endgame, we want to trade pieces from that. If we're cramped, if we have a spatial disadvantage, we also want to trade pieces, make some more space for ourselves. If tactically we have to, because either we're going to lose material or we can gain material from doing so, then that's another reason to trade pieces. So those are our big reasons to trade, right? Now, why should we not do it? Well, we still need to develop. If it's the opening, it's early on, and we don't want to give our opponent the edge there. We don't want to make multiple moves to trade off those pieces, so we want to make sure we're thinking about development. Remember, don't be afraid to calculate, maintain the tension. If we have a spatial advantage, the counterpart to what we said before, avoid trading pieces if you have a spatial advantage. That way you have more to work with, more chance to press that advantage. And if we're down in material, if we're down in material, keep pieces on the board. Fight for a way to make things complicated and try to see if you can come up with a nice defense for what your opponent is doing. So those are the reasons we have for why we should and shouldn't trade off our pieces. Now there's exceptions to every rule. These are some general rules of thumb. Every position has its own reasons why we should or shouldn't, but these are some nice guiding principles to keep in mind. If we can remember these in our head, we're going to start getting some better positions. We're going to have our pieces working better for us, and we're hopefully going to have some nice winning chess matches. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments below, and I wish you the best of luck in your games to come. Can't wait to see what you do on the chessboard.